Elite design, better comfort, more grip. Our new Pure Grip Socks Elite add engineered compression, an anti-blister base, and more grip to keep you locked in. Available now at puregripsocks.com.
The perfect football boot doesn't exist in the sense that there isn't any one pair of boots or even a style of football boots that will be quote unquote perfect for everybody. But in the context of modern leather football boots, other than the super high price tag and kind of weird cotton based laces, this is as close to perfection as I think we'll see all year. Ladies and gentlemen, say hello to what has unfortunately been a much more limited release than originally anticipated in the made in Japan Mizuno Morelia DNA, the upper of a Morelia 2 with the sole plate and stud pattern from the Neo 4, where there are some other minor tweaks when comparing those two football boots, but that's pretty much the gist of what the Morelia DNA is all about. I think it looks fantastic in this new Platinum Pack colorway, but colorway really is the key word here because this is not the first time Mizuno have released the DNA model. Whereas boot enthusiasts, we often complain about the best football boots always being the most limited, and unfortunately that's the case with the DNA as well. It really is a shame that this isn't an inline product for Mizuno, but even if it were inline, it would also be the most expensive regular model football boot on the market, where in Europe, this boot retails for 310 euros, which is the equivalent right now of about $340. But honestly, they're worth it. We're going to discuss what makes these football boots so perfect, talk a little bit about some of the very subtle drawbacks that these might have depending on your personal preferences, take a look at how they fit and feel on feet, and ultimately conclude why you might actually want to think about spending $300+ on these incredible football boots. So if you're interested in learning more, please stick around, watch the entire review, and if you're interested in a pair of Morelia DNAs for yourself, there will be a link down below. Get them before they're gone, because like I said, Mizuno only seems to release these every once in a while, this being definitely one of the more limited drops compared to what we've seen in the past. And as always, if you enjoy the content, don't forget to drop a like on the video, and if you appreciate the unsponsored, unsugar-coated, brutally honest opinions on this channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button along with the little bell notification so you don't miss out on my reviews of all the latest football boots of 2025. Now, for those of you that are looking at these football boots and saying to yourself, I don't really care for leather, I don't really like the way that they look, and there's absolutely no way I would ever spend that much money on a single pair of football boots, quite frankly, these are not for you. And if that's you, that's probably going to be your opinion of the entire Made in Japan Mizuno product line, in that they're all very expensive, and while the quality is as good as it gets, it's hard to justify from an experience standpoint for a lot of people, in that you can get something that plays just as nicely from their much less expensive but still very high quality Elite line. Granted, there is no Elite variation of the DNA, although if Mizuno ever decided to do that, I think they would sell so many pairs. But what I love about the DNA in general is that it kind of goes along the lines of what Mizuno has been as a football boot brand for the last 10 years or so, in that they're a brand that gives the people what they want. Wouldn't it be awesome if Nike took the best features from all their different football boots and combined them into one? That's exactly the concept of the Morelia DNA. The incredible touch, fit, and comfort of the Morelia 2 with the lightweight feel and aggressive traction of the Morelia Neo. Where focusing strictly on the upper, it's exactly what you would get on the Morelia 2, minus some modifications to the heel, which we'll talk about in just a second. But everything that you see in silver is the finest quality kangaroo leather that you'll find in the world of football boots. So soft, so flexible, a little bit more padded than what you'd get from obviously the Morelia Neo series, which also gives you kangaroo leather in the forefoot. But because this is a Morelia 2, that leather doesn't just stop at the forefoot, it flows through the midfoot as well, and you even have it across the top of the foot in the form of the tongue. You have a traditional U-throat construction with a standalone tongue, a nice deep central lacing system for amazing adjustability, and the Mizuno Runbird logo in gold, which is the only synthetic element you'll find on the main body of the upper that acts as both a visual element to show the branding of Mizuno, of course, but also adds a little bit of subtle reinforcement to the midfoot, which makes this boot feel much more secure on your feet than I think a lot of people might expect based on its old school aesthetic and generally just all over soft kangaroo leather construction. To make a long story short, if you are a soft premium kangaroo leather football boot fan, this is simply put as good as it gets. But you can already get that with the standard Morelia 2, so why spend the extra money on the DNA? Well, it's what's happening on the bottom of this football boot, where with the standard Morelia, you are of course getting a more old school design for the sole plate and stud pattern, modern materials in terms of the plastic used, which makes this much lighter than I think a lot of people might expect. But if you simply just wanted a more responsive, aggressive traction type of feel, then it would only make sense to pair the Morelia 2 upper to the sole plate and stud pattern from the Speed Boot Morelia Neo series, which is exactly what the DNA has done. That of course includes the external heel counter that's a part of that sole plate tooling. You end up with what is a fairly responsive sole plate feel in the forefoot that's definitely a little bit firmer than what you're going to find on the classic Morelia. And of course, you're getting those Neo conical studs all through the foot, which offer a longer stud length than what you're going to find on the standard Morelia 2 and a much narrower profile, meaning that they dig into the ground and provide much more bite than a more traditional stud layout would typically offer. And again, one of the major unique aspects of the Morelia Neo in general is that it is a speed boot with conical studs, which I personally think pairs up so well with the slightly more traditional Morelia 2 upper on this DNA model. Where if you don't care about the more aggressive traction, by all means just go for the regular Morelia 2. It's less expensive and always readily available. It's one of the best football boots on the market if you want to prioritize comfort and a soft leather touch. But if you've always loved the Morelia 2 but wanted something more speed boot-esque in terms of the underfoot feel, that's exactly what the DNA delivers. It's not until you get to the rear of the boot where you're going to notice some design changes from the standard Morelia 2 and even the Morelia Neo 4, where if you look at it side by side with the standard Morelia, obviously the general design is very similar, but you'll notice that it's cut a little bit higher on the DNA, and it's also significantly more pinched in its overall shaping, which kind of relates it more closely to the fit and heel area of the Morelia Neo, but at the same time with a little bit more of that Morelia 2 tradition. All your structure is now coming from that external heel counter. The back area ends up being relatively soft otherwise, which I think makes for great overall comfort. And you'll also notice the lining material is the same as the Morelia Neo in that it's a soft kind of microfiber, almost suede type material, where on a standard Morelia 2, the heel is typically lined in like a smooth synthetic leather. This small change on the DNA, I would personally argue, feels a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more premium, and this material in general just does a slightly better job of gripping your socks, which I think makes for overall better lockdown and generally just a little bit more of a speed boot-esque fit in the heel area compared to the more traditional style of that classic Morelia. I just love the fact that it's so soft all the way through. And then as far as the insole is concerned, that's fully removable. I'll give you guys a quick look at that. It's very standard in that you can see it just says Morelia, has the Made in Japan designation, has this really soft kind of microfiber suede-like lining, and then it's just a single layer of black foam where you'll now see the Morelia Neo designation. Again, given that this was basically taken from the Morelia Neo because the DNA is sitting on top of a Morelia Neo sole plate. And then there's the weight, where I thought it'd be interesting to see which of these three is the lightest. The Speed Boot Morelia Neo 4 Beta, the more traditional Morelia 2, or the combination of both of these boots in the Morelia Neo, all in the same size 9.5 US. We'll start off with the classic Morelia 2, and you can see that they weigh in at a very lightweight 7.5 ounces, the equivalent of 212 grams. Remember those numbers, change the scale back to ounces, and we'll throw on the dedicated speed boot in the Neo 4 Beta. They weigh in at 7.2 ounces, the equivalent of 204 grams. So again, very lightweight. Change the scale back one more time, and we'll throw on the Morelia DNA, which you can see weigh in at 7.2 ounces, the equivalent of 205 grams. Where maybe this comes as a bit of a surprise to a lot of you, but there really isn't much of a weight difference between these three. Yes, the Morelia 2 is a little bit heavier, 7 grams when compared to the other two, but it's such a small amount of weight that I would almost argue that it's insignificant. And again, despite the DNA being a full kangaroo leather upper, rather than combining leather and all the technical materials of the Neo 4 Beta, there is not even 1 gram to separate the two. In other words, if you're trying to pick between these three, it's much more important to focus on the fit and feel differences between them rather than how much they weigh, because as you can see, they're all going to be pretty light on feet. On feet, the Morelia DNAs fit and feel exactly like you would expect them to. The soft upper of the Morelia 2 with the exact same shape as that standard model, but sitting on top of the Speed Boot sole plate from the Morelia Neo series. It's a perfect hybrid of the two football boots. And basically, if you're somebody that has tried the Morelia Neo and would prefer something with a little bit of extra width and maybe just a slightly more relaxed fit in terms of how the upper wraps your foot, particularly through the midfoot, the Morelia DNA might be exactly what you're looking for. Where of course it must be said that comfort is at the end of the day very much subjective. If you want something that has more of that kind of hardcore speed boot feel, you might actually prefer the Morelia Neo 4 Beta over the DNA. This, from a feel on feet perspective, definitely relates a little bit more closely to the more traditional Morelia 2 in the sense that it's the same upper with the exact same shape, width, and volume. But personally, I find that to be the most comfortable pair of football boots on the market. And I can't really say that I think the DNA is more comfortable. I pretty much put them on the exact same level. But regardless, to be compared to the most comfortable football boot on the market is pretty much as big a compliment as I can give. The upper is incredibly soft. I love the fit in the heel. The adjustability from the nice deep central lacing system is fantastic. And again, compared to a standard Morelia 2, the sole plate, because it's from their speed boot line, has a little bit more kind of structural integrity and more responsiveness than what you might expect from an upper that typically fits and feels like this one does. From a width perspective, they have plenty of width to them, to the point where I think these are going to work for just about anybody. Even if you had slightly slimmer profile feet, I still think these are going to work really nicely. And as far as sizing is concerned, I'm wearing these in my usual size 9.5 US, and the fit and the length is perfect. So if you are looking to get a pair for yourself, I would strongly recommend going true to size in order to achieve the best possible fit. So in conclusion, it's really quite simple. If you're a leather football boot fan and you can justify the very steep $340 price tag, the Morelia DNA is, simply put, a no-brainer. It is the best football boot of its type and as close to perfection as you're going to find. However, if you don't care as much about the speed boot sole plate, I'd probably save the money and go for the standard, still very expensive granted, Morelia 2 made in Japan, or if you just like something that's maybe a little bit thinner and more speed boot focused, opting for the regular made in Japan Morelia Neo 4 Beta, still very expensive by the way, would also be a really solid move. The DNA, like I said, combines those two football boots, so if that's something that you've always wanted, this is, like I said, the perfect product. The only thing that sucks is Mizuno doesn't make it available all the time.